The river took me the way rivers take the arrogant, all at once, and from below. I remember the bank giving way under my paws, the black water closing over my head, and the cold reaching so deep into my chest that even my wolf, who had never feared anything in 400 moons, went quiet with the knowledge that this was how a king ends. Not by a rival's teeth, not by a blade in the dark, by snowmelt and a swollen river and my own certainty that no water could hold me. I had ridden out alone against every counsel, tracking the raiders who had burned the downriver villages, and I had run my wolf too far and too hard, and when the flood came off the mountains, it did not care that I was Corian Vale, Alpha King of the Highreach, whose name mothers used to quiet frightened pups. It rolled me under and spun me and filled my throat, and the reeds tore past too fast to catch, and I felt the last of my strength go out of my legs. So I did not see her come, I only felt hands. Hands in the water, closing in the ruff of my sodden neck, small hands, a woman's hands, and behind them a weight throwing itself backward against the pull of the current. I heard a voice through the roar, low and even and stubborn, saying, come on, you great fool, not to me as a king, but to me as a drowning animal, which is what I was. She had waded into a night flood that would have swept a grown man off his feet, for a beast she did not know, and she was not letting go. I want it understood, before anything else in this telling, what that is. I have commanded warriors who would die on my word. I have never in my life seen courage like a stranger walking into black water for a life that could give her nothing back. She got my forequarters onto the reed bank, and then, when my legs would not answer, she simply refused the river its meal. She hauled. She braced her heels in the mud and hauled again, cursing me kindly the whole while, until the water lost its grip and I was out, streaming and half dead on the cold ground, and she went down on her knees beside me in the dark and put her ear to my chest to listen for a heart. There, she breathed when she found it. There you are, don't you dare. I could not lift my head. I could only lie in the mud and look at the shape of her against the racing clouds, a slight woman, soaked to the bone, her dark hair pulled loose by the water, her face turned down to mine with a fierce and unreasonable tenderness, as though I mattered, as though I were not a monster twice her size who might, waking, take her arm off at the shoulder. She got an arm under me. I do not know where a woman that small found the strength, except that I have since learned she found strength wherever she needed it and asked no one's leave. She dragged and coaxed me up out of the reeds and across a stretch of marsh to a low hut with one lit window, and she got me over the threshold and onto her own hearthstones, and she shut the door on the storm. That was the first thing Ussold ever did for me. She shut the door on the storm. I lay by her fire and I could not move and I did not try. I watched her strip off her drowned shawl and kneel to build the flames higher, and I watched her bring rough blankets and pack them around a wet wolf's body without one heartbeat of hesitation, and I understood that she had done this before, not for a wolf perhaps, but for the lambing ewe and the fevered child and the old man dying alone in the reeds. Her hands knew how to save things. They moved over me checking for broken bones with a healer's certainty, and where they pressed too near a wound my lip pulled back off my teeth on instinct, and she did not flinch. She only said, I know it hurts. Let me, in that same low, even voice, and this is the truth, strange as it is, I let her. My wolf, who let no one near, let her. I should have wondered at that then. I was too far gone, I slept. When I surfaced it was still dark and she was sitting against the wall beside me with her knees drawn up, keeping watch, a chipped cup of something hot cooling forgotten in her hands. She thought I was asleep. She was talking to me the way lonely people talk to animals, low, not expecting an answer, and so I learned who my rescuer was from her own mouth before she knew I could understand a word. She was called Ussold, and the marsh folk of the Vashenmoor called her other things. The Drowned Land's witch, the Reed Widow. She had married young and buried her husband to the same river 3 winters past, and because she lived alone at the water's edge and knew which herbs broke a fever and which stopped a wound from souring, the frightened and the ignorant had decided her knowing was unnatural. They came to her door in the night when their children burned with fever, and they let her save those children. And then in the daylight they crossed the lane to avoid her and taught their sons to throw stones at her roof. She had been turned away from the market that very week, driven off. Her basket of herbs tipped into the mud, told the drowned land's witches' cures weren't wanted among decent folk. And she had come home and wept where no one could see. And then she had dried her face and gone on saving the things they brought her anyway. They'll be sorry someday, she told the wolf she thought could not understand, and then she laughed at herself softly without bitterness. No, they won't, but you don't care, do you? You just needed pulling out of the water. She reached out and very gently laid her hand on my great sodden head. We're a pair then, nobody wanting either of us. Get well and go home to wherever wants you more than this. I lay still under her hand, and I made a vow into the firelight that she did not hear. I have been asked since what it was, the thing that turned in me that night, whether it was the bond, whether my wolf knew her for a mate the moment her hands closed in his rough in the river. I have thought long about it, and the truth is plainer and stranger than destiny arriving like a thunderclap. It was not the bond first. It was that I had ruled the Highreach for 400 moons and been feared and obeyed and flattered, and I had never once been cared for. Not like this. Not by hands that did not know they held a king and would have done exactly the same for a stray dog. The bond came after, and when it came it only confirmed what her kindness had already decided in me. But it did come. Toward dawn the warmth of her fire and her blankets brought me back enough that my body began the long, slow work of shifting home. She had fallen into a doze against the wall, worn out, and she did not see it begin, the fur receding, the shape lengthening, the wolf giving way to the man beneath it, as our kind do when we are safe enough to let the beast rest. I felt it come, and I could not have stopped it if I'd wished to, and I lay there caught between shapes, dreading the moment she woke to find a naked stranger, a man, where her helpless wolf had been, and knew herself alone at the water's edge with him. She woke as the last of it finished. I heard her breath catch. I made myself lie utterly still, made no move toward her, kept my eyes down and my hands open and empty on the hearthstones, and I said, before she could reach for the iron poker I could see her eyes go to, I will not touch you. You saved my life. I would sooner cut off my hand than frighten you in your own house. For a long moment there was only the fire. Then in that same steady voice, though it shook now at its edges, you're the wolf, the one from the river. I am. You're a skin changer, not an accusation, a healer fitting a new fact into her understanding of the world. There are stories, upriver, the wolf kings. Her eyes moved over me, not the way a woman looks at a man, but the way she'd looked at me all night, checking, assessing, are you hurt, are you whole? You were dying, she said. In the flood, that was you. That was me, and you walked into the water for me not knowing what I was. I turned my head then slowly and let her see my face. Why? She looked at me as though it were the simplest question in the world and I a fool for asking it. Because you were drowning, she said. And there it was, the moment the bond struck me, not like a thunderclap after all, but like the last stone set into an arch, the thing that had been building all night finally bearing its full weight. Because you were drowning. No calculation in it. No knowledge that the drowning thing was a king who could raise her out of her poverty with a word. She had done it for nothing, expecting nothing, and it undid 400 moons of being wanted only for my crown. I felt the mark then. Every alpha of my line carries it, a silver tracery over the heart, quiet all our lives until it finds the one it was made to answer. It woke. It burned, a clean bright heat spreading under my ribs. And I looked down and saw it shining through the dark, and I heard her draw a sharp breath because on the inside of her own wrist, a mark she had carried since birth and been mocked for as one more witch sign, a pale silver curve she'd hidden under her sleeve her whole life, had woken to match it. The two of them, answering across the space between us, the way they were made to. She stared at her wrist, she stared at the light over my heart. What is that? She whispered. It means, I said, and my own voice was unsteady now, that I have been looking for you my whole life without knowing your name. It means the mark they mocked you for is the oldest mark my people know. It means you are not the drowned land's witch, Ussold. You are the one my line waits 400 years to find, and you saved my life in the dark without any idea that you were saving your own king. She did not swoon or weep. She was not that kind of woman, and I have thanked the moon every day since that she was not. She sat back against the wall and looked at me, this half-drowned king on her hearthstones, and after a while she said, with the dry steadiness that I have come to love more than any softness, "Well, that's a great deal to learn before dawn." I laughed. It surprised us both. I had not laughed, I think, in a year. I stayed 3 days in her hut, because I was still weak and because I could not bear to leave. And in those 3 days I learned her the way a man learns the one thing he means to keep. I learned she hummed while she worked and did not know she did it. I learned she gave away cures to people who'd stoned her roof and refused to let their cruelty make her cruel. I learned she had been lonely so long and so quietly that she'd stopped believing loneliness was a thing that ended, and I watched her begin, hour by hour, to believe it might. And I told her the truth of what I meant to do, and I gave her the choice because a bond is not a chain, and I would rather have gone home alone forever than take her against her will. "I will not carry you off," I told her. "You saved me freely. Whatever you give me, you'll give freely too, or not at all. If you tell me to go home and forget the marsh, I'll grieve it, but I'll go." She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "The people here threw my basket in the mud 4 days ago, and a king's asking me to come and be his queen." She shook her head, not in refusal but in wonder at the size of it. "Nobody will believe it." "They will believe it," I said, "by the end of the week. I promise you that." I went home. I raised the Heinrich. I did not raise it for vengeance. I want that understood, for Ussold would not have let me, and she was already, though she did not yet wear it, my queen in every way that governed my hand. I did not come to the Vashenmoor to burn the market or shame the mother who tipped her basket in the mud. I came the way a king comes for his queen, which is to say I came in the open, in full sight, with my banners down the river road and my pack at my back and my crown on my head, so that no soul in that mean little marsh town could ever again pretend they did not know what they had thrown away. We came at midday when the whole of the Vashenmoor was in the square. I saw the moment they understood the raiders they'd feared were nothing to this, an alpha king in his full power walking his wolves down their lane, and the whisper went through them like wind through the reeds, "What have we done? What have we brought on ourselves?" They fell back against the walls. Some of them went to their knees out of plain terror, and I walked through the middle of them and did not look at one of them because I had not come for them. I walked to the edge of the town, to the low hut at the water's line, and Ussold came out onto her own worn threshold in the plain gray dress they had mocked her in, with her marked wrist bare for the first time in her life because I had asked her never to hide it again. And in front of the whole of the people who had named her witch and thrown stones at her roof, I went down on one knee in the marsh mud. The alpha king they were all crawling to please, I knelt to her. "You pulled me out of the flood not knowing what I was," I said, loud enough for every soul in the Vashenmoor to hear it. "You'd have done it for a stray dog. That is why it is you, and could only ever have been you. Come and be my queen, Ussold of the marshes, not to repay a debt, because there is no one else in the living world I would have." The square was so silent I could hear the river. And then my whole pack, 40 strong, the wolves that bowed to no living thing but their king, lowered themselves to the mud at her threshold in one motion, bowed to the drowned land's witch, the reed widow, the woman whose basket lay tipped in that very market 4 days gone. The marsh folk saw their wolves kneel to the woman they'd stoned, and I watched shame come into their faces one by one, the slow, terrible shame of people learning exactly what they had had among them and spat on. Ussold looked at me kneeling in her mud, and at 40 wolves bowed at her door, and at the town gone silent behind us. And she did not gloat, because it was not in her. She only reached down and took my hand and drew me up to my feet, the same steady hands that had pulled me from the black water, and she said quietly for me and not for them, "I told you nobody would believe it." "Believe it," I said. She came home to the high reach as my queen. She would not let me punish the marsh folk, and instead, because she was who she was, because the river never made her hard, she sent healers downriver to the Vashon Moor every spring, so that no one in that mean little town would ever again burn with fever and have no one to bring their child to. They send reeds to our wedding day each year now, the whole town, bundled reeds tied with river grass, the only apology a poor place knows how to make. She keeps everyone. People ask me sometimes whether I resent the river that nearly killed me. I tell them the truth. I have been Alpha King of the High Reach for 400 moons and more, feared and obeyed the whole of my life, and I did not know until I was drowning what it was to be simply cared for by hands that wanted nothing from me. The river did not take my life. It carried me down to the one pair of hands that would not let go. And every night, when she reaches over in the dark and her marked wrist brushes the mark over my heart and they both go warm at once, I lie awake a moment in the quiet and think of a low voice in a night flood, stubborn and kind, saying, "Come on, you great fool, to a beast it did not know." And I am, still and always, grateful I was drowning. I lay by her fire and I could not move and I did not try. I watched her strip off her drowned shawl and wring the river out of it into the ash bucket, her hands red with cold, and I watched her kneel to build the flames higher without once turning her back fully to the great wet beast on her hearth. Not from fear, I understood later, but from a healer's habit of keeping her patient in the corner of her eye. She brought rough blankets from a chest and packed them around my body without one heartbeat of hesitation, tucking them under my chest and along my spine the way you swaddle something that has stopped being able to warm itself. Her hands knew how to save things. They moved over me, checking for broken bones with a certainty that came from 100 nights like this one, and where they pressed too near the gash along my flank, my lip pulled back off my teeth on pure instinct, a warning that would have sent a grown warrior stumbling backward. She did not flinch. She only said, I know it hurts. Let me," in that same low, even voice, and pressed on and cleaned the wound and packed it with something bitter-smelling from a clay pot and bound it. My wolf, who let no living creature lay hands on him uninvited, who had opened the throats of men for less, my wolf lay still and let her. I should have wondered at that. I was too far gone to wonder at anything. I slept, and it was the first true sleep I'd had since the villages burned. When I surfaced, the fire had burned down to a red bed of coals, and the storm had thinned to a steady rain on the reeds, and she had not gone to bed. She was sitting against the wall an arm's length from me with her knees drawn up and a chipped cup cooling forgotten in her two hands, keeping watch over a stranger's beast the way a mother keeps watch over a fevered child. She thought I slept. And so, in the low hours when the loneliest people say the things they cannot say by daylight, she began to talk to me, not expecting an answer, the way you talk to an animal or a grave. And I learned who my rescuer was from her own mouth, in her own words, before she had any notion I could understand a single one. Her name was Ussold. The marsh folk of the Vashon Moor had other names for her. The Drownedlands Witch, they called her. The Reed Widow. She told the sleeping wolf all of it quietly, as though laying it down where it could do no harm. She had married at 17, a marshman with a good boat and a laughing mouth, and she had loved him the plain, uncomplicated way you love at 17, and 3 winters past the same river that had nearly taken me took him instead, went out to check his lines in a spring flood and never came back, and they found the boat but not the man. She had been a wife in the morning and a widow by nightfall, and something in the town had turned against her from that day, as though a woman the river spared when it took her husband must have bargained for it somehow. Because she lived alone at the water's edge, because she knew which reed broke a fever and which root stopped a wound from souring and which bark brought a hard birth to a safe end, because her knowing saved people, and frightened people cannot forgive being saved by the thing they fear. So they made her a witch. It cost them nothing, and it explained everything. Why the river spared her, why she lived apart, why her hands could do what the barber surgeon in the town could not. And here is the part I have never been able to think of without my jaw going tight. Even now, even with all of it long mended, they used her anyway. She told the wolf this without bitterness, which was somehow worse than if she'd wept it. They came to her door in the dark, the same men who spat when she passed in daylight carrying children blue with croup, wives gray with childbed fever, old fathers rattling their last breaths, and they begged the drowned land's witch to save what they loved. And she opened her door every time. She never once turned a sick child away to punish the parent. She saved them, and took their frightened thanks, and watched them cross the lane to avoid her the very next morning as though the night had never happened. She taught their sons her herbs by saving those sons' lives, and those same sons threw stones at her roof to prove to their fathers they were not bewitched. 4 days before the flood, she told me, she had gone up to the market with a basket of what she'd gathered and dried, feverfew and willow and the good marsh mint, thinking only to trade it for flour and a little salt, for she had almost nothing. And a woman whose daughter Ussold had pulled back from a fever the winter before, a woman who had wept in this very hut and kissed Ussold's hands, and called her a saint at 3 in the morning. That woman had seen her in the daylight square, among the decent folk, and had gone white with the shame of being seen to know her, and to cover it had knocked the basket clean out of Ussold's hands into the churned mud of the market. Told her the drowned land's witches' cures weren't wanted among God-fearing people. And the square had laughed or looked away, which is the same thing, and Ussold had knelt in the mud to gather what she could of a week's careful work, and carried the ruined basket home, and wept where no one could see her. And then I got up, she told the wolf with a small tired laugh at herself, and dried my face, and that night old Herod's grandson came with the croup, and I sat up till dawn with him, and he'll live. She shook her head. You'd think I'd learn. She was quiet a moment. The rain ticked on the reeds. They'll be sorry someday, she said, and then laughed again softer because she was too honest for the comfort of it. No, they won't, people don't, but you don't care about any of that, do you? She set the cold cup down and reached out, slow, giving the great sleeping beast every chance to wake and warn her, and she laid her hand very gently on my head between the ears, the way you gentle a horse you meant to calm. You just needed pulling out of the water. That's the whole of what you needed from me. Her thumb moved once absently over the coarse wet fur. We're a pair then, you and I, nobody in the world wanting either of us. So get well and get your strength and go home to wherever it is that wants you more than this place wants me. One of us ought to have somewhere. I lay under her hand in the dying firelight, and I made a vow into the coals that she did not hear and would not hear for days yet. A vow with no witnesses, which are the only vows that ever bind a king. I vowed that the words nobody in the world wanting you would never again be true of the woman whose hands were resting so lightly on a monster's head, trusting it not to wake and take them. I have been asked many times since what it was that turned in me that night, whether the bond had seized me the moment her hands closed in my rough in the black water, whether my wolf had known her for a mate from the first and everything after was only the knowing catching up. I have turned it over 1,000 times, and the truth is plainer and stranger than a destiny that arrives like lightning. It was not the bond that came first. It was this. I had been Alpha King of the Highreach for 400 moons. I had been feared. I had been obeyed. I had been flattered by men who wanted my favor and courted by women who wanted my crown, and I had been served and saluted and knelt to every single day of my ruling life. And in all of it, in all those 400 moons, I had never once been simply cared for, not tended by hands that did not know they held a king, not sat up beside all night by someone who'd have done exactly as much for a drowning dog and thought no more of it. Her kindness asked me for nothing because she did not know there was anything to ask, and a thing in me that had been starving my whole life without knowing its own hunger sat up in that firelight and fed. The bond came after that, and when it came, hours later in the gray before dawn, it did not arrive to make me want her. It arrived to confirm what her kindness had already decided in me, the last stone set into an arch that had been standing under its own weight all night, waiting only for the peace that would let it bear a kingdom. Toward dawn the warmth of her fire and her blankets, and the deep animal safety of that hut did what no healer's art could have hurried. It brought me back far enough that my body began the long, slow work of shifting home. Our kind hold the wolf when we are hunted or hurt or afraid. We let the man return only when we are safe enough to set the beast down. That my wolf chose, in a stranger's hut, to lay himself aside and let me surface, I have never found better proof of what she was to us than that. She had made a king's wolf feel safe enough to sleep as a man. She had dozed at last, worn to the bone, her head tipped back against the wall and the empty cup fallen sideways in her lap. And so she did not see it begin, the fur receding like a tide going out, the long shape drawing in and shortening, the wolf giving way to the man beneath it. I felt it come and could no more have stopped it than stopped the dawn, and I lay there caught between the two shapes with a dread rising in me that had nothing to do with the river. Because in a breath she would wake and find a man where her helpless beast had lain, a naked stranger, a full-grown alpha, alone with her at the water's edge in the last dark hour of the night, in a marsh where no scream would ever be heard. Everything her cruel neighbors had ever whispered about the danger of a woman living alone was about to walk out of her own hearth fire. So I did the only thing I could. As the last of the shift left me, I made myself go utterly still. I did not rise. I did not reach for the blanket to cover myself, for reaching is a movement and movement is a threat. I lay exactly where the wolf had lain, my eyes down, my hands open and empty and flat on the warm hearthstones where she could see them, and when I heard her breath catch, heard the small sharp sound of a sleeping woman waking to a wrongness in her house, I spoke before she could reach the iron poker I had already seen her eyes go to. "I will not touch you," I said low, not lifting my head. "You saved my life tonight. I would sooner cut off this hand than raise it against you in your own house. Look, my hands are on the floor. They will stay there." For a long moment, there was nothing in the whole world but the tick of the coals and the rain. Then in that same steady voice, though it shook now at its edges the way a held rope shakes, "You're the wolf, the one from the river." "I am." "You're a skin changer." Not a scream, not an accusation, a healer setting a strange new fact carefully into its place among all the other facts of the world. "There are old stories, upriver, the wolf kings, the ones the mountain folk swear by." I heard her shift, heard the faint scrape of the poker being taken up. After all, I did not begrudge her it. I'd have thought less of her sense if she hadn't, and then her eyes went over me and I felt the exact moment her fear bent back toward her training, because she did not look at me the way a frightened woman looks at a strange man. She looked at me the way she had looked at the beast all night. "Are you hurt? Are you whole? Where is the wound I bound?" "You were dying," she said slowly. "In the flood, that was you. That was you the whole time. That was me, and you walked into a night flood for me not knowing what I was." I turned my head then, slow as the dawn, and let her see my face for the first time, not a monster's, not a stranger come to harm her, only a man, tired and marked by the river and looking back at her with something in it he did not know how to hide. "Why?" I asked her. "You could have left the beast to the water and gone home dry. Why come in after it?" She looked at me as though it were the simplest question ever put to a person, and I a great fool for needing it answered. "Because you were drowning," she said. And that was the moment it struck me, not like lightning after all, but like the last stone dropped into an arch that has stood all night under its own gathering weight, the piece that finally lets the whole span bear a kingdom's load. Because you were drowning. Nothing else in it. No reckoning of what the drowning thing might be worth. No notion that the beast in the reeds was a king who could lift her out of her poverty and her loneliness with a single word. She had done it for a life that could give her nothing back, expecting nothing back, and it finished the work her long, kind night had already begun. It undid 400 moons of being wanted for a crown and left me, for the first time in my life, simply chosen for myself. I felt the mark wake. Every alpha of my blood carries it, a fine silver tracery laid over the heart, quiet as a sleeping thing the whole of our lives, until the day it finds the one soul it was forged to answer. Mine had slept 400 moons. It woke now. It burned, a clean bright heat spreading out under my ribs like sunrise coming up through water. And I looked down and saw it shining silver through the dark of the hut. And across the small space between us, I heard Ussel draw a hard breath. Because on the inside of her own left wrist a mark she had carried since the cradle. A pale curve of silver she had hidden under her sleeve her whole life, because the marsh folk had named it one more witch sign. That mark had woken to answer mine. The two of them, calling across the space between a king and a marsh widow, warming in the same instant, the way they were made from the beginning to do. She stared at her own wrist as though it belonged to a stranger. "What is that?" she whispered. "What is happening? I've had it since I was born. My mother had one. They said it was the witch mark, the reason the river." "It is the oldest mark my people know," I said, and my own voice was no steadier than hers now. "It is the mate mark of the Hyrich kings. It sleeps in my line until it finds the mark it was made to match, and yours is the one, Usselt. It has always been the one. It means the mark they mocked you for your whole life is the mark that says you are the queen my blood has waited 400 years to find. It means you are not the drowned land's witch. You never were. You are the one soul in the living world my wolf would lay himself down and sleep beside. And you dragged him out of the flood in the dark, without the first idea that you were saving your own king." She did not swoon. She did not weep. She was not built for either, and I have blessed the moon every day since that she was not. She set the poker down slowly, deciding it, and she sat back against the wall and looked at me for a long, long while. This half-drowned king washed up on her hearthstones, and at last she said, in the dry level way that I would come to love beyond any softness in the world, "Well, that is a very great deal to learn before dawn." I laughed. It broke out of me before I could think, and it startled us both, and I could not remember when I had last done it. Sometime before the villages burned, before the long hard year, before I had forgotten there was any sound in me but command. I stayed 3 days in her hut. I told myself it was because my strength was slow to come back, and that was half true. The river had taken more out of me than I liked to admit, and my flank ached where she'd bound it. But the truer reason was that I could not make myself leave, and she, though she'd have gone to the stake before she said it, did not seem in any hurry to have the hut to herself again. And in those 3 days I learned her the way a man learns the one thing in his life he means to keep until he dies. I learned she hummed while she worked, tunelessly, and did not know she did it, and stopped the moment she caught herself as though she'd been caught at something foolish. I learned she could not sit to eat until everything living within reach of her door had been seen to first. The goat, the hens, the half-wild marsh cat that came for scraps, the man on her hearth. I learned that in 3 whole days, with a king telling her she was a queen, she never once asked me what she would have, what jewels, what halls, what power. She asked instead whether the villages the raiders had burned had healers enough, and whether the children of those villages were being fed. I learned that the people of the Vashenmoor had spent 3 years teaching her she was worth nothing, and had very nearly succeeded, and that underneath the place where they'd worn her down there was something they had never once managed to touch, a plain deep steadiness, a refusal to let their cruelty turn her cruel, that was worth more than every jewel in my treasury, and that no king in the world could have bought. And I told her plainly what I meant to do, and then I gave her the choice, and I meant it to my marrow. For a bond is not a chain, whatever the old songs make of it, and I would have gone home to my cold hall and lived out my reign alone before I would take her one step against her will. "I will not carry you off," I told her on the 3rd night, both of us by the fire. "The stories make wolf kings into thieves who throw a woman over a saddle and ride. I am not that. You came into the water for me freely. Whatever you give me after, you will give freely too, or you will not give it, and I will live with that. If you tell me to go home and forget the marsh, I will grieve it every day I have left. But I will go. Say the word and I go, and you never see me again." She was quiet a long while, looking into the coals. When she spoke, it was not to refuse me, and not quite yet to have me. It was the plain arithmetic of a woman who had learned the hard way not to trust a thing until she'd turned it over in her 2 hands. 4 days ago, she said, a woman I'd sat up all night to save the child of knocked my whole week's work into the mud and told me I wasn't fit to stand among decent people. And now a king is kneeling by my fire asking me to come and be his queen. She shook her head, not a no, but the shake of someone measuring a thing almost too big to hold. Nobody down that lane will believe a word of it. They'll say the witch enchanted a passing madman. They'll say I drowned some poor soul and conjured a king to cover it. They will believe it, I said, before the week is out, that I can promise you. I went home, I raised the high-reach. Understand me, I did not raise it for vengeance. I want that set down plainly, because the songs will want to make it a burning, and it was not, and it was Ussold who made certain of that before I ever rode. She was not yet crowned, and already she governed my hand, the way she has governed it kindly ever since. I did not muster my pack to put the marsh down to the torch, nor to shame the woman who tipped her basket in the mud, nor to make one frightened marsh child pay for the sins of frightened marsh elders. I came the way a king comes for his queen, which is to say, I came in the full light of day, in the open, where every soul could see, with my banners down the length of the river road, and my pack loping at my flanks, and the iron crown of the high-reach on my brow. I came so that no living soul in that mean little town could ever again pretend to themselves that they had not seen exactly what they had thrown into the mud. We came at midday, when the whole of the Vashenmoor was gathered in the market square, that same square where the basket had been struck from her hands. I felt the moment they understood. The raiders they had lain awake fearing were a child's tale beside this, an alpha king in the whole of his power walking his wolves up their lane, and the knowing went through the crowd like wind laying down a field of reeds. That low sick ripple of what have we done, what have we called down on ourselves. They fell back against the walls of their own houses. Some went to their knees in the mud from plain terror, thinking I had come for them. I walked through the middle of them and did not turn my head to one, because not one of them was why I had come, and I think that frightened them worse than any drawn blade, a king who would not even spend his anger on them. I walked the length of that town to the low hut at the water's line, and Ussold came out onto her own worn threshold to meet me, not decked in anything I'd sent, for I had sent nothing. I wanted them to see her exactly as they had made her, in the plain gray dress they had mocked, with her marked wrist bare to the daylight for the first time in her life because I had asked her, only that, never to hide it again. She stood on the doorstone where she had wept 4 nights before, and she was not trembling. And there, in the mud of the Vashenmoor, in the full sight of every soul who had ever named her witch and stoned her roof and used her hands in the dark and scorned them in the sun, I, the Alpha King they were all on their knees to please, went down on one knee to her. You pulled me out of the flood, I said, and I pitched it to Carrie so that the farthest child at the back of that square would hear every word and carry it the rest of his life. You walked into black water at midnight for a beast you had never seen, that could give you nothing, and you never once asked what it would earn you, because there was nothing in you that could think that way. That is why it is you. Not the mark, not the blood, not any old prophecy. That, the woman who'd have done as much for a drowning dog. Come and be my queen, Ussold of the marshes, not to pay me back, for you were never owed. Because in the whole of the living world there is no one else I would have beside me, and there never will be. The square had gone so silent, I could hear the river running behind the hut. And then my pack, 40 strong, the wolves of the high-reach that had never in living memory bowed their heads to any creature that walked but their own king, lowered themselves into the marsh mud at her threshold. All of them. In one motion, as though a single breath moved them, they went down before the drowned land's witch, the reed widow, the woman whose basket had lain spilled in that very square 4 days gone. The marsh folk watched the king's own wolves kneel to the woman they had thrown stones at, and I watched the shame come into their faces one by one, slow and terrible, not the shame of fearing me, but the far worse shame of understanding, all at once and far too late, exactly what they had had living among them, and exactly what they had done to it. Usold looked down at me kneeling in her mud. She looked at 40 wolves bowed at her door. She looked last out at the silent town that had spent 3 years grinding her toward nothing. And she did not gloat. There was no gloating anywhere in her. The river never made her hard. She only reached down with the same 2 hands that had closed in a drowning beast's ruff and hauled him back from the dead, and she took my hand, and she drew me up to my feet. And she said for me, and not for them, low enough that the square had to hold its breath to catch it. I told you nobody would believe it. Believe it, I said. She came home to the Hyrich as my queen, and the whole of my cold hall warmed the day she walked into it. She would not let me punish the Vashan more. I had known she would not, and I had loved her the more for it, even as I'd half hoped she might relent. Instead, because she was who she was, because 3 years of cruelty had not managed to teach her cruelty in return, she did a thing I would never have thought of. She sent healers downriver to the marsh every spring, trained in her own herb craft, so that never again would a child of that town burn with fever in the night and have no one to carry it to. The people who had named her witch send reeds to our wedding day now, every year without fail, plain bundles of riverweed tied round with grass, the only apology a poor and shamed place knows how to make. She keeps every bundle. There is a chest of them growing in our chambers, one for each year, and she will not let a single one be thrown away. People ask me sometimes whether I hate the river that so nearly killed me. And I tell them the truth of it. I ruled the Hyrich 400 moons and more before that flood, feared, obeyed, saluted, knelt to every day of my life. And I did not know, in all that time, what it was to be simply cared for by a pair of hands that wanted nothing from me and did not even know there was anything to want. The river did not take my life. The river carried me down, past all my power and all my crown, to the one pair of hands in the whole wide world that would not let go of a drowning beast in the dark. And every night, when she reaches across the space between us in her sleep and the silver mark on her wrist brushes the silver mark over my heart, and the two of them go warm at once in the dark, I lie awake one moment in the quiet of it, and I hear again a low, stubborn voice in a night flood, kind to a creature it did not know, saying, come on, you great fool. And I am still, and to the last day I am given, grateful that I was drowning.